At the town of Schmidt, in the Hurtgen forest, it was hard to see through the thick mist and steady drizzle on the cold and damp morning of Saturday, November 4th, 1944. Bomb craters filled with rainwater dotted the bleak landscape. The spongy ground sucked at soldiers' boots, and thick mud clung to their leggings and pants, adding to the misery of fighting in the woods in the rain with little sleep. Suddenly, rounds from German howitzers whooshed downward and slammed into the ground, causing it to shake like an earthquake. For the next half hour, the Germans pummeled the town with their heavy artillery. When the big guns stopped, the American riflemen heard the clanking of tanks. The woods were soon alive with German infantry. The deadly crump of mortars and the chatter of machine guns filled the air. GIs armed with bazookas tried in vain to stop PZKP-W.IV and PCPF-W Panther tanks. Their shells bounced harmlessly off the steel. The tanks roamed at will through the town, hunting Americans in houses or in foxholes. The tanks had smashed through the two forward company positions and broke them all to hell, said Captain Guy T. Piercy, commander of a weapons company. The situation was bad. Overwhelmed by the Germans' staggering firepower, some of the GIs fled from their positions at 8:30 a.m. 90 minutes later, the rest of the 3rd Battalion, 112th Infantry Regiment quit Schmidt. They disappeared into the forest, leaving their dead and wounded to the Germans. The German counterattack at Schmidt was indicative of the setbacks Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges' First Army experienced in the Hurtgen Forest from mid-September 1944 to early February 1945. The story of the battle begins just before the capture of Aachen, the first large city in Germany to fall to the Americans. Maurice Rose's 3rd Armored Division had advanced in September into the Stolberg corridor between Aachen and the Hurtgen Forest, putting the Allies within 20 miles of the Rhine River. The division's right flank came to rest on the northwest rim of the forest. On September 13th, the division made an incursion into the forest in the vicinity of the town of Hurtgen. The crack Armored Division, however, was pointed to the east beyond the Siegfried Line, or the West Wall as the Germans called it, so it did not become embroiled in the forest. As the division advanced, it also took the small villages of Schmidhof, Rott, and Brandt, peripherally located on the Hurtgen Forest's northwestern edge. As a result of the division's eastward attack, the incursion was a brief encounter with a dense evergreen forest that soon completely thwarted the troops of Hodges' First Army. On its way to the Battle of Aachen, Major General Clarence R. Hübner's vaunted 1st Infantry Division had encountered the German defenses on the northwestern fringes of the Hurtgen Forest. Division troops attacked Aachen from the south, which resulted in limited contact with the foreboding woods as they advanced north to encircle the city. Just like the 3rd Armored Division, it was to be saved the agony of the forest and its elaborate defenses, but it suffered nevertheless. The 1st Infantry Division, though, was not to see the last of the forest. There were two striking characteristics about the forest battle. The first was the nature of the woods and the German defenses inside the woods. The second was the complete inability of Hodges and 1st Army headquarters to appreciate the challenges of fighting in such an environment. 1st Army troops would have a horrific experience in the front line in the woods, while the headquarters staff remained in comfort, removed from the intense fighting and great suffering. The Hurtgen Forest is actually 3 woods: Weinau, Hurtgen, and Röttgen. The dark evergreen forest lies on the border of Belgium and Germany and astride the West Wall. It occupies a 50-square-mile triangle-shaped area bounded by the towns of Aachen, Düren, and Monschau. 2 ridges are angled southwest to northeast through the forest toward the Rohr River. The village of Hurtgen is located on the northern ridge, while the town of Schmidt is situated on the southern ridge. Between them, the Kahl River flows through a forbidding gorge. The ridges were bare of trees, which made them good places for artillery and for monitoring enemy movements at lower elevations. The dense woods would negate the advantages the Americans enjoyed in mobility, firepower, and technology when fighting in open terrain. At the outset of the prolonged battle, the dense forest canopy immediately caused orientation problems for the Americans. The U.S. combat units entering the forest had few maps of the woods. Those they did have were in German and were difficult to interpret. From an aerial point of view, it was confusing to orient those existing maps with the ground configuration. This had an adverse effect not only on the provision of close air support but also on field artillery attempts to respond to requests for fire support. The absence of distinguishable landforms in the Hurtgen forest made it nearly impossible for spotter aircraft to orient themselves and effectively direct fire for artillery units. Bringing effective fire to bear was at times a hit-and-miss affair as the U.S. artillery had to shoot blind. The Hurtgen forest was not unlike other forests in Germany. As the land has been intensely cultivated over many centuries, so have its forests. The Germans responsible for managing the forest resources over the years did so in a way that would result in a maximum yield from its fir trees. Before machines were developed to remove the logs, horses performed that function. The trails, therefore, were at best covered with grass, but more likely were simply soil. When the logs were dragged along the trails when the ground was hard, little damage was done to the trail surface. But in rainy spells, the trails became muddy, and wheeled transport frequently got bogged down, particularly when extensive use was made of the trails. After sustained rain, the trails resembled creeks. The true test was whether a quarter-ton truck could negotiate a trail that had turned to mud. If the trail in an inclement state could not support a quarter-ton truck, then the trail failed the test as a viable means of travel. The Hurtgen forest, except for a few hard surface roads, failed the test and contributed significantly to logistics and communications failures. The Germans found that by felling one or two trees they could easily block a trail, and they made good use of this tactic to slow U forces. Trails were not only easy to block, but the maps often failed to show where they led. Sometimes the trails did not even show up on the map. It was easy to get lost following what appeared to be a trail leading in a desired direction, but which had no specific definition when it came to leading to a military objective. The resulting confusion was compounded by the Germans' expert use of the trails to form fields of fire for direct fire weapons, such as the dreaded 88 mm anti-tank artillery. American troops often could not effectively call for artillery fire using trails for orientation because of the disparate directions the trails frequently took. The best targets were villages and towns located in cleared areas. The closely bunched trees in the Hurtgen forest served the German defenders well. Airbursts from German mortars and artillery sent shards of wood spiking into the forest floor or into the heads and bodies of American soldiers. For this reason, American soldiers attempting to advance under such bombardment conditions were vulnerable to indirect enemy fire. While the American artillery and mortars could have the same effect on the German defenders usually were protected by well-constructed field fortifications or concrete bunkers. The trees also worked their misery on unprotected soldiers in tandem with the weather. A large amount of rainfall, especially during the autumn and winter action, meant that water hung in the overhead foliage only to drip constantly on soldiers without overhead cover, whether moving through the forest or in their open foxholes. American soldiers found themselves confined to waterlogged holes, which led to immersion foot or trench foot. Casualties among soldiers who could not keep their feet dry were extremely high and the cause for much consternation among upper echelon command. The Hurtgen forest had other characteristics associated with the weather that affected combat operations. Dense fog and mist in the autumn and winter tended to hang in the valleys and among the trees. This hindered direct observation and posed a danger not only to patrols, but also to any movement, as it often proved difficult for a soldier to see more than a few feet. It was easy to get lost and disoriented walking a short distance, or to accidentally stumble into an enemy patrol. Since the Germans had a better knowledge of the woods, they had a decisive advantage over the Americans when it came to moving through the forest. In spite of the poor quality of some of the German infantry units at this stage of the war, the Germans nevertheless managed to exploit the full defensive potential of the Hurtgen forest. They could tell from the ring of an axe being used to cut down a tree, and by the direction of the sound of the axe, just how to bring fire to bear on the GI wielding the axe. The Americans learned the hard way that when they wanted to cut down a tree to build a protected fighting position, it was best to use a handsaw. American vehicles operating in the woods telegraphed their movement by their distinctive sounds. The Germans had fewer vehicles, and they used their horses effectively in the dense woods to move artillery. The Hurtgen forest stood at the northern end of the 390-mile west wall. The forest was thoroughly integrated into the Germans' fortification system. Even without fortifications, the forest posed serious threats, but the combination proved to be a major obstacle to American forces. The German defense of the Hurtgen forest made use of many different techniques that stymied the American advance and compounded the effects of the forest's natural features. The trails not only served as deadly fields of fire, but also were heavily mined and booby-trapped. The Americans had a difficult time overcoming the mines. The Germans placed thousands of personnel mines in about every conceivable place. They could be closely grouped and stacked one or more on top of each other. When an American soldier went to remove a mine, he had to be sure it was not booby-trapped, or that there was not another mine set to explode when the weight of the top mine was removed. It soon became standard operating procedure to blow up mines in place rather than try to remove them. The Germans covered forest trails and paths with weapons fire from well-concealed fighting positions. They had a special knack for camouflage. It was not unusual for an American soldier to be standing right beside a German field fortification and not be aware of it. The German positions not only were well located to provide flanking fire, but also they provided excellent overhead protection against American artillery fire. Because the Hurtgen forest was part of the West Wall, there was an abundance of permanent fighting positions located throughout the forest. The Germans built elaborate concrete bunkers that were often 2 or 3 stories deep into the ground. They were perfectly camouflaged with leaves and pine needles, and blended seamlessly into the surrounding landscape in a way that made them almost invisible to the American troops. They had to be reduced by infantry and engineer troops using explosive charges and small arms fire. Once captured, a bunker or concrete position had to be secured against recapture by the Germans. German tactics took full advantage of the features of the terrain and weather while making optimum use of their defensive expertise. The Germans registered with mortars and artillery the roadblocks they had established to slow down the Americans. When the Americans fired their artillery, the Germans would fire their own behind the Americans to make the Americans think that their own artillery rounds were landing short. German soldiers cut American telephone lines and effectively monitored the largely undisciplined American radio transmissions, which allowed them to eavesdrop on American tactical operations and activities. If the terrain and German tactics and fortifications were not formidable enough, Hodges and his chief of staff, Major General William B. Keane, proved themselves to be insufferable throughout the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. Hodges, who had an abrasive personality, held the record for relieving the most corps and division commanders in Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. He canned 10 of 13 generals. He was quick to condemn others' shortcomings, but he took umbrage if someone insinuated that he might have contributed to the failure of one of his units. During the protracted battle, he was often sick, leaving much of the combat direction to Keane. Keane proved to be the key figure in the chain of command and ran the staff in such a way as to brook no opposition to command decisions. The rest of the staff operated as if it knew the answers to all challenges and projected a negative attitude to First Army units, which manifested itself in a blind stubbornness and ultimately resulted in heavy casualties. The First Army staff was the least effective of Bradley's three armies. Hodge's First Army had 3 corps, but only 2 fought in the Hurtgen Forest. One was Major General J. Lawton Collins' 7 Corps, and the other was Major General Leonard Jarrow's V Corps. Collins' 7 Corps comprised the 4th Cavalry Group, 1st Infantry Division, 9th Infantry Divi Scion, and the 3rd Armored Division. Jarrow's V Corps was composed of the 102nd Cavalry Group, 4th Infantry Division, 28th Infantry Division, and the 5th Armored Division. Collins's 7 Corps would spearhead the attack into the Hurtgen, and Jarrow's V Corps would advance to the south to cover Collins's right flank. 3 factors in particular would contribute to the agonizingly slow progress that Hodges's First Army would make through the Hurtgen Forest. The first factor was the dense nature of the woods, which slowed the American advance to a crawl. The second factor was the Germans' stubborn defense. The third factor was First Army's command shortcomings and the adverse effect these problems had on frontline combat units. The initial, relatively brief encounters in the dark forest experienced by the U.S. 3rd Armored Division and the U.S. 1st Infantry Division were also experienced during Major General Louis A. Craig's 9th Infantry Division's penetration of the West Wall on September 13th. Craig's division would be the first of several to experience the Hurtgen Forest's death grip. The 1st Battalion of the division's 39th Infantry Regiment crossed the German border from Belgium, almost unopposed into the town of Lammersdorf on September 14th. Lammersdorf was situated just outside the southeast corner of the Hurtgen Forest abreast of the West Wall fortifications. Hardly had the U.S. infantrymen advanced beyond the town when the German 98th Infantry Division sprang into action. German gunners inside pillboxes poured heavy fire into the advancing Americans, pinning them down. This marked the beginning of the battle. The battle began with tedious, small unit combat against a determined but understrength enemy. By September 18th, the Americans had managed to carve only a 11 2-mile-wide path through the German fortifications at the forest's edge. Frequent rain and thick cloud cover limited the number of close air support missions that U.S. ground attack aircraft could fly. The quality of the German forces the 9th Infantry Division faced offered the Americans some degree of solace, though. Colonel Karl Roessler's 89th Infantry Division, which by that time was composed of only 2 grenadier regiments, was badly depleted in manpower. Created in January 1944 with conscripts from the replacement army, the division had suffered heavy losses in Normandy. By September, one of its 2 remaining regiments was almost non-existent as a result of attrition, and the other had only 350 men. Roessler had scraped together his artillerymen, engineers, and service troops and put them on the front line. The German High Command had reinforced his division with a battalion of reservists, 3 battalions of Luftwaffe ground protection troops, and a battalion of 450 Russians pressed into German service. Deployed to the north on Roessler's right flank across the German L.A. Corps boundary was the German 9th Panzer Division. The Panzer Division also was badly under strength. It had 2,500 grenadiers, 200 machine guns, and 13 Panther tanks. The Germans' best hope lay in the anticipated arrival from the eastern front of Colonel Gerhard Engel's 12th Infantry Division. The division had 14,800 men organized into 3 infantry regiments, each of which had 2 battalions. It also had 12 batteries of artillery. The lead elements of the 12th Infantry Divi Scion began arriving in the northern part of the Hurtgen Forest on September 16th. Engel's troops initially engaged elements of Rose's U.S. 3rd Armored Division and the 47th Infantry Regiment. The arrival of Engel's troops compelled Major General J. Lawton Collins, the American 7 Corps commander, to direct Hubner's 1st Infantry Division, Rose's 3rd Armored Division, and Craig's 9th Infantry Division to consolidate their positions by shortening their line. Collins then ordered the 9th Infantry Division, after a brief pause, to begin clearing the Hurtgen forest to remove the threat the Germans there posed to his right flank. The Schwammenau and Erf dams, known as the Rower Dams, were becoming increasingly important objectives to Hodges's First Army. The Rower Dams had only belatedly been gaining recognition as justification for a continued advance. Bradley, Hodges, and Collins agreed that the Americans needed to seize the dams to prevent the possibility of the Germans releasing the water and flooding the Rower Valley. If that occurred, millions of gallons of water would keep the river at flood stage for weeks, inundating the entire valley. The Rower River at flood stage might delay the passage of American forces for several weeks. When Collins ordered the 9th Infantry Division into the forest in September, the need to capture the dams had not been considered a critical intermediate objective in First Army's advance to the Rhine. To accomplish the forest-clearing mission, arrayed north to south in the Hurtgen Forest, were the 9th Infantry Division's 47th, 60th, and 39th Infantry Regiments. Beginning on September 19th, the division sought to capture the key crossroads town of Schmidt on the eastern edge of the forest near the dams. Schmidt, which was located just over a mile west of the dams, lay behind the west wall in open terrain. Its seizure was essential to the capture of the dams. At that point, the progress of the U.S. infantry began to be measured in yards rather than miles. American close air support was limited. Fog and mist at ground level obscured observation even if the skies above were clear. These conditions precluded effective support. Within the forest, tanks and tank destroyers had difficulty maneuvering and bringing their guns to bear. By the close of September, the 60th Infantry Regiment had bludgeoned its way aimlessly through a morass, almost reaching the Germeter-Hurtgen-Kleinau road in the forest. The 39th Infantry Regiment had reached the Lammers-Dorf-Germeter road on the 60th Infantry Regiment's south flank, but the Germans still held Schmidt. By October 6th, the 9th Infantry Division held a 9-mile front. Before the division could capture Schmidt, it had to take other villages. The 39th Infantry on the left and the 60th on the right received orders to capture the villages of Germeter and Wassenack, cross the Kahl River Valley, and advance through the hamlet of Kammerscheid to Schmidt. A narrow, twisting path known as the Kahl Trail led south from Wassenack through the woods to the Kahl Gorge. Beyond the gorge lay Kammerscheid and Schmidt practically adjacent to each other. It was a tall order given the fierce German resistance. General Hans Schmidt's 5,000 strong 275th Infantry Division opposed the two American regiments. Although his division was not at full strength, its troops nevertheless had constructed log bunkers, foxholes, and roadblocks. They also had laid mines, strung barbed wire, and established interlocking fields of fire. On October 6th, the two U.S. regiments attacked. They immediately ran into tenacious resistance. Although advance elements pushed through the pillboxes of the West Wall, progress was extremely slow. U.S. tanks and tank destroyers arrived 2 days later to assist the infantry. The armor's extra weight resulted in a limited penetration of the West Wall. The 200-strong German battle group known as Regiment Vegelein, which was named after its commander, Colonel Wolfgang Vegelein, began moving south toward the Hurtgen on October 11th to assist the 275th. The following morning, Wegelein's men, who were well armed with submachine guns, machine guns, and mortars, attacked the northern flank of the 39th Infantry Regiment at the village of Wittscheid. The Americans held on to the village, but the counterattack forced them to halt short of Schmidt and consolidate their positions. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, the tired, disillusioned, and bedraggled U.S. soldiers were forced to withstand ever-worsening weather, constant enemy patrols, and withering artillery fire. On October 25th, the 9th Infantry Division, except for the 47th Infantry Regiment, was allowed to pull out of the front line for rest and rehabilitation. In less than 4 weeks, the 9th Infantry Division had suffered 4,500 casualties. Moving up to replace the 9th Infantry Division was Major General Norman D. Dutch, Coda's 28th Infantry Division. It was known alternately as the Keystone Division or Bloody Bucket. Hodges and his staff remained firmly convinced that the best route to the Roer Dams was through Schmidt. Hodges ordered Dutch Coda to send all 3 of his regiments against the Germans. He reinforced Coda with 3 engineer combat battalions, a battalion of towed tank destroyers, and a chemical mortar battalion. As October drew to a close, the Germans began earnestly preparing for Wacht am Rhein, the German code name for the Ardennes counteroffensive. The preparations involved the withdrawal and reconstitution of forces, some of which were elite panzer formations that had been deployed near the Hurtgen forest. Because of this, the fighting against the Americans fell to third-class German infantry divisions. The experience of Dutch Coda's troops is summarized in the division's combat chronicle. The 28th smashed into the Hurtgen forest on the 2nd of November 1944, and in the savage seesaw battle which followed, Wassenack and Schmidt changed hands several times. Coda deployed the 109th Infantry Regiment on the left, the 112th Infantry Regiment in the center, and the 110th Infantry Regiment on the right. The regiments advanced in unison on November 2nd. Lieutenant Colonel Carl Peterson's 112th Infantry Regiment in the center initially had the most success. Backed by M4 Sherman tanks, the GI's managed to fight their way into Wassenack. German grenadiers armed with Panzerfaust knocked out 5 Shermans, but at least the Americans had something to show for the destroyed tanks. The following day, 2 battalions of the 112th crossed the Kahl River. The 3rd Battalion, 112th Regiment, fought its way through Kammerscheid and entered Schmidt. The Americans caught the German garrison in Schmidt by surprise. By nightfall, the town was squarely in the hands of 3 American rifle companies and a weapons platoon. Exhausted from the previous day's march, they decided not to send out any patrols that night. But the Germans launched a vicious counterattack. The advancing enemy wiped out the 3rd Battalion. The Germans also retook Kammerscheid before the counterattack ground to a halt. By the end of the first week in November, only Wassenack was still in American hands. After the fighting on the Kahl Trail ended, the regiment held only the western slope of the gorge. Coda's 28th Infantry Division had suffered the same heavy casualties that the 9th Infantry Division had suffered. As the 28th Infantry Division was pulled out of line for rehabilitation on November 16th, First Army prepared to make another major push to reach the Roer River. By then, 3 U.S. infantry divisions were in the Hurtgen forest. They were deployed north to south as follows: 1st, 4th, and the primary responsibility for clearing the forest at that point fell to Major General Raymond O. Barton's 4th Infantry Division. Barton had orders to clear the Germans from the forest and then proceed northeast to the Roer River at Dueren. Combat Command R, CCR, of the 5th Armored Division moved up to assist Barton's division in capturing the village of Hurtgen, which lay north of Wassenack. Schmidt's grenadiers braced for the attack of a fresh American division. Barton was promised air support. Despite inclement weather at Allied bomber bases in France and England, the bombers conducted bombing runs against the German positions in the Hurtgen in mid-November. Unfortunately, the bombs had minimal effect on the German fortifications. The Americans also unleashed the fire of nearly 700 artillery pieces against the German positions. The 4th Infantry Division soon became yet another victim of the forest. Its 12th Infantry Regiment suffered heavy casualties in 9 days of bitter fighting. Despite the heavy casualties incurred, the regiment seized control of key roads in the forest on November 16th that allowed CCR's tanks and tank destroyers to launch a major assault against German forces in the village of Hurtgen. But the Germans mauled the 12th Infantry Regiment, which by November 21st had suffered 1,600 casualties. Adjacent U.S. infantry regiments had no better luck in the forest as they struggled to clear the stubborn German resistance. As early as mid-September, the 9th Division had demonstrated that to send widely separated columns through an obstacle was to invite disaster, states the U.S. Army's official history. Yet on a second occasion in October 9th, Division had tried the same thing, and in early November 28th Division had followed suit. Now the 4th Division was to pursue the same pattern. In a number of actions in the eastern sector of the forest, both the 8th and 22nd Infantry Regiments of the 4th Infantry Division Strug gled forward, having to confront not only inclement weather and stiff German resistance, but also supply difficulties. By December 2nd, the regiments were on the verge of finally breaking out of the forest when they halted, but in doing so, they had suffered enormous losses. To the north, Hübner's 1st Infantry Division, after severe fighting in the northwest portion of the forest, initially made enough progress to give higher headquarters some encouragement, but the intractable weather combined with stubborn German resistance kept the division from advancing out of the forest to drive to the Roer River. One of the 1st Infantry Division's key objectives was the village of Heistern. With the assistance of artillery and tank fire, a battalion of the division's 18th Infantry Regiment succeeded in getting into the village the night of November 21st. That night, Colonel Josef Kimbacher, commander of the 104th Regiment of the 47th Volksgrenadier Division, led his troops in a counterattack. The Americans repulsed the attack and took 120 prisoners, including Kimbacher. Vicious fighting continued as both sides fought to control key terrain. The Germans launched an attack to retake Hill 203, and once they captured it, they fought tenaciously to hold it because it afforded excellent observation over the surrounding terrain. The U.S. 18th Infantry Regiment drove the Germans from Hill 203 on November 24th. Meanwhile, the 8th Infantry Division, which was assigned to V Corps with the 5th Armored Division CCR in support, engaged the Germans. The 121st Infantry Regiment engaged 4 understrength battalions of the 275th Infantry Division in the mud, fog, and rain for control of the villages of Hurtgen, Kleinau, Brandenburg, and Bergstein. By December 9th, American M4 Sherman tanks had swept through the villages. The attached 2nd Ranger Battalion advanced from Bergstein and captured the excellent observation site of Hill 400.5, more familiarly known as Castle Hill, but the Germans immediately counterattacked and retook it. The 2nd Ranger Battalion suffered 25% casualties. Overall, the late November and early December push resulted in more than 1,200 U.S. casualties. A hiatus occurred at that point as both sides concentrated on the Ardennes campaign. During that time, the 83rd Infantry Division relieved the battered 4th Infantry Division. However, the 1st and 8th Infantry Divisions remained in place. In 2 months of sustained fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, 5 U.S. infantry divisions, along with a Ranger Battalion and an Armored Combat Command, had suffered severe casualties. Losses amounted to approximately 5,000 men per division. The main objective of the battle, the Roer Dams, would remain in German hands until February 1945. Even at the outset of the Battle of the Bulge, Hodges remained fixated on capturing the Roer dams. He even launched yet another push to capture them. But when it was realized that the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes threatened the entire Western Front, Bradley compelled Hodges to switch to a defensive position. From mid-December to January 31, 1945, the action in the Hurtgen Forest was limited to local patrolling. On February 5th, Major General James M. Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division and the 78th Infantry Division launched an attack from the western edge of the Hurtgen Forest to capture the Erft and Schwammenau dams on the Roer River. The paratroopers were shocked at what they saw as they took up their position on the Call Trail to protect engineers clearing mines. Immobile tanks and trucks and the bodies of dead American soldiers were everywhere, said Lieutenant John Cobb of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The snow and cold had preserved the dead, and they looked so lifelike it gave one a very eerie feeling. Gavin established his command post in the Hurtgen Forest and saw firsthand the nightmarish conditions through which the Americans had suffered 33,000 casualties. All along the sides of the trail there were many, many dead bodies, cadavers that had just emerged from the winter snow, wrote Gavin. Their gangrenous, broken, and torn bodies were rigid and grotesque, some of them with arms skyward, seemingly in supplication. Such was the harvest of death in the Hurtgen Forest. With orders to capture Kammerscheit and Schmidt, the 82nd Airborne fought its way down the trail, across open terrain to Kammerscheit, and continued on to Schmidt. The next step was to seize the two dams and prevent the Germans from flooding the area below the dams. The capture of the dams came several months too late, though, in some respects. Had we secured them early in November 1944 and pushed across the Roer, the enemy would never have dared counterattack us in the Ardennes, wrote Bradley. The belated task of capturing the Schwammenau Dam was to be undertaken by troops from the 309th Infantry Regiment of the 78th Infantry Division. They approached the dam from the south while the 82nd Airborne Division put pressure on the enemy from its positions at Schmidt. Under German artillery and mortar fire on the night of February 9th, American engineers and riflemen clambered atop the 170-foot-high dam to find it intact with no explosives attached. The Germans, however, had used another method to thwart the Americans. The American engineers soon discovered that the gatehouse, power room, and discharge valves controlling the flow of water from the dam had been thoroughly smashed. An immense amount of water was already rushing downstream. Furthermore, the Germans had dynamited an outlet valve on the smaller upstream Erft Dam, which released additional water into the basin of the Schwammenau Reservoir. The Battle of the Hurtgen was over, but by flooding the Roer River, the Germans delayed the Americans from crossing it for 2 weeks. The Hurtgen Forest debacle was a costly one for the Americans in more ways than just failing to accomplish a timely capture of the two dams. From the beginning, the vague objectives assigned to the American divisions committed to the Hurtgen Forest resulted in heavy casualties not only in personnel, but also in weapons and equipment. More than 8,000 First Army men suffered from combat exhaustion, and another 23,000 men were killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Multiple factors, including inclement weather, rough terrain, and enemy counterattacks, together with a corrosive command environment, combined to take a heavy toll on the American forces involved. In retrospect, it was a battle that should not have been fought, wrote Gavin. The battle for the Hurtgen Forest stands as one of the major mistakes of the war in Europe. On the whole, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest produced heavy casualties for very little strategic benefit.